And if you will, make your way in your Bible to Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. I want to begin reading an episode from the life of Jesus here in Luke 12. And then I'm going to tell you a story that will intertwine with Jesus' teaching here, and then we'll make a few lessons and applications, and we'll bring to a close this series of studies. So read with me. I'm in Luke 12, and I'm starting in verse 13. Where Luke says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you?" And then he said to them, "Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, 'What shall I do since I have no place to store my crops?' Then he said, 'This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns, and I will build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, so you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" Let that linger for a moment and we'll come back to it. Carl McCunn was born to an army family stationed in West Germany at the time of his birth. After he finished high school, he tried a semester of college before opting for a 4-year stint in the Navy. And when his military service was completed, he sort of bounced around on the West Coast, gradually working his way north until he got to Alaska, and that's where he settled. Because for Carl, Alaska was a perfect fit. His passion was wildlife photography. And so does it all make sense? If that's where your interest is, there just aren't many places in the world better than Alaska. In fact, in 1976, Carl wandered off in the wilderness early one spring and spent an entire summer all by himself, off in the Alaskan wilderness taking pictures. And so none of his friends were surprised 5 years later when he planned a second excursion, this time to some remote place 225 miles northeast of Fairbanks. He planned his journey meticulously. He hired a bush pilot who was to fly him up in March and drop him off. And he set aside 5 months during the early spring and through the summer that he would devote to his passion. He assembled everything that he was going to need, all kinds of cameras and photographic equipment, 500 rolls of film, 1,400 pounds of supplies, 3 rifles. I think I would have taken more than 3. It was the Alaskan wilderness. And he would chronicle the whole adventure in a journal that he kept on loose-leaf notebook paper. And so in March of 1981, he went to the bush pilot, and the pilot took him up and dropped him off in the spot he had chosen, and his adventure began. And I imagine that the months just flew by, don't you? Isn't that the way it is when you're doing stuff you love? It just seems like time flies by. And so before Carl knew it, it was August. And summer was coming to an end. Summers don't come to an end in August in Texas, okay? That's just when we're getting real nice and heated up. But it's Alaska, right? Summer's beginning to wrap up. Supplies are beginning to dwindle, and fall is coming. And it was time for Carl to begin thinking about his exit. And it was at that moment in August, as fall is coming and supplies are dwindling, that it occurred to him for the very first time throughout this whole adventure that he could not remember if he had made arrangements with that bush pilot for him to come back and pick him up. In his journal he wrote, I think I should have used a little more forethought in arranging for my departure. Yeah. This was serious, folks. This isn't a weekend at the state park where you just kind of walk up to the ranger station and say, I need a little help here. This is alone in the Alaska wilderness, and winter is coming. There's nobody to call. And so with every day that passed, Carl grew more and more anxious. And yet all hope was not lost. Carl had friends. And when he didn't come back, his friends got worried and they went to the authorities, who went to the bush pilot, figured out where he had taken him. And so they sent someone up to look for him. And sure enough, the pilot flew right over his campsite. And when he heard the plane, Carl came out of his tent. He watched the plane bank on the horizon, come back for another pass. And as the plane flew by, he celebrated just like this. Pay attention to that, it's important. He celebrated just like this. He had been found. He was going to be rescued. And it was only as that airplane disappeared on the horizon that he remembered that this is the signal for a man on the ground to tell a pilot in the air, I'm okay and I don't need any help. I know, I think it's a dumb signal too. But evidently that's what it is. And so the pilot went back and said, yeah, I found him and everything is fine. By the time October rolled around, he was running out of food. In that journal he wrote, it's been a terrible day for me. I won't go into it. Hand getting more frostbitten every day. Have only one meal of beans left. Honestly, I'm afraid for my life. When November rolled around, the food was gone. And it was at that point in November that he thought, maybe I just ought to pack up and walk to Fort Yukon, the closest civilization, 75 miles away. Maybe I ought to just walk out. But it was November. Not Oklahoma, Texas November, Alaska November. The weather was brutal, and by now malnutrition is setting in, and it was clear that he just was in no physical condition for what would have been such an incredibly difficult journey. The truth is that the door of opportunity to do that had passed weeks and weeks before. Around Thanksgiving, he wrote, I feel miserable, have had the chills upon awakening for the past 3 days. I can't take much more of this. And then among his final journal entries was this note. Dear God in heaven, please forgive me my weaknesses and sins. Please look over my family. He used the last little bit of fuel he had for one more fire before using one of those rifles to take his life. The authorities did find him almost exactly a year from when he'd been dropped off. That's a sad story, isn't it? I have to tell you, the first time I read his whole story in the New York Times article where it appeared, I found myself extraordinarily frustrated by the story. There were just some sort of obvious kinds of things that a man doing the kind of things Carl was doing that he should have remembered to do. And so I think it's very easy to read his story and walk away and think, man, that guy was really dumb. That man was a fool. But before we're too quick to judge, could I ask you to consider this? as I pondered his story, it occurred to me that his little adventure into the Alaskan wilderness bears a striking resemblance to the way a lot of people make their way through this life. They get all caught up in the details of the journey here and now and consumed with what I'm doing today, and they go all the way through life, living life with no plan for getting out of here. And I just wonder, folks, if we think it's foolish for a man to wander off into the Alaskan wilderness with no exit strategy, how much more foolish for a person to make their way through this life with no exit strategy. Failing to acknowledge that one last storm that's coming. And so, as I pondered Carl's story, there were some things about the story that made me think about some things in the gospel that relate to our end that is coming. And so that's what I want to talk to you about for a little while tonight. I want us to think about our exit strategy as we ponder what the gospel teaches about the end. I want to draw three parallels between Carl's story and the end that is coming before all of us. Before I do that, can I just tell you how wonderful it's been for Heidi and I to be with all of you for the last few days? I certainly don't want to fail to thank you for all the many acts of kindness, from the basket that was waiting for us in our hotel room to all of the meals and the wonderful visits that we've had, and just more things than I've got time to list tonight. I could go on and on, but we are so very grateful for everything that you've done for us the last few days. And it has been wonderful to get to know John and Rhonda. You know, we just missed each other. We left school just as they were coming to school. So, and so John's right, that means we're older. But it meant we missed an opportunity to get acquainted. And so though we've known each other, this is our first chance to spend time together. And that's been such a blessing to us. Good to be with the good men who shepherd this church. I'm grateful to them for the invitation. But I will tell you the thing that I appreciate more than anything else is that I look over this crowd tonight and I see familiar faces, because at every single service you've been sitting here. And you've been so kind and patient to listen carefully to the things that have been said. And to those of us that preach, that just means more to us than anything else. So let me tell you how much I appreciate that. And my wife and I are wishing God's great blessing on all of you as you keep doing His thing up in your little corner of the world here in Oklahoma. And I hope you'll pray for us as we go back to the humidity and try to do our thing back in Texas. So, I want to talk a little bit about our exit strategy tonight and some things that Carl's story make me think about when it comes to the end that I am facing. First of all, one of the things that his story reminds me of is the fact that the end is coming. I know that's kind of a basic place to begin, but listen, we have the capacity to ignore the obvious, and we need to be reminded that the end is coming. Carl certainly knew that. This isn't an episode of Alaska Frontier or one of those shows where he's headed out there to build a cabin and put out roots and stay. That was not the plan. From the very beginning, Carl's plan was to go there for a little while, do his thing, and then he was headed back to civilization. And so from the beginning, the plan was always to leave, which then begs the question, if you're not planning to stay, how could you not have a plan for your exit? And don't you already kind of know the answer to that? I think the problem was Carl got so wrapped up in taking his pictures and doing what he loved to do. He was all about the here and now, what I'm doing in the moment, and he didn't let his mind go there. He didn't let his mind drift there, not until it was necessary, not until the end. Let that thought linger. And ponder with me the fact that we know the end is coming too. Folks, you can't read the Bible without being confronted with that reality. Could we look at that just a little bit for a minute? I'm going to head over to Hebrews 9. I want to start there tonight because I think in the last two verses of that chapter, the Hebrew writer reminds us of three stones that serve as the foundation for Bible teaching about the end. Ponder that with me as we read these two verses. This is Hebrews 9, verse 27. Look for these three stones in the foundation of Bible teaching about the end. So verse 27, the Hebrew writer says, "And inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment, so Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation without reference to sin to those who eagerly await Him." Now let me identify the three stones for you. Number one, in verse 27, he said, "It is appointed for men to die once." There's stone number one. We're going to die. We know that, right? It isn't as though there's some question about how this is all going to work out for us. Ultimately, all men die. All of us pass that way. None of us are going to escape it. And so it is a reality that is looming for us, one that is coming. And again in Scripture, we're reminded that from the moment we take our first breath, the countdown clock starts. And it is counting down to that day when with certainty every one of us sitting here tonight will draw our last. We will die. Certainly die. And then in verse 28, the second stone in the foundation is this appearing of Christ a second time. Do you see that? First, we're going to die. Then, Jesus promised when He left the earth, in Acts chapter 1, He promised, "I will come again." And so there's the return. Jesus Christ is going to come back. Most certainly there will be a day when the trumpet Paul talked about in his letter to the Thessalonians, the trumpet is going to sound, and everything that has been going on in life up to that point is just going to come to a screeching halt. The Lord is coming. The Lord will surely return. And then back up to verse 27 for the third stone in the foundation. "It is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment." When the Lord returns, there will be judgment. Men will answer. They will give an account for the lives that they have lived here on earth. And what I want you to see is as you make your way through the New Testament, those three ideas come up again and again and again, and in different contexts. They're expounded on, more detail is given, but that is the foundation of the Bible teaching about the end. Could I illustrate that for you? Back up to Matthew 25. Because in Matthew 25, Jesus goes on an extended discussion about this very topic. Matthew 25, run your finger down to verse 31, where the text says, "But when the Son of Man comes in His glory," there it is, there's His return, "and all the angels with Him, then He will sit on His glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before Him, and He will separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And He will put the sheep on His right and the goats on His left." What's being described there? Judgment is happening. In verse 34, it says, "The King will say to those on His right, 'Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world.'" Do you see that? Verse 41, "Then He will say to those on His left, 'Depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire that has been prepared for the devil and his angels.'" There's going to be judgment. Men will be separated based on the lives that they've lived. Verse 46 says, "Of the wicked they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." That's what we've been talking about. You start making your way through the Bible, and the Bible begins to open up to us the details about what's going to happen in the end. Jesus is coming. Judgment is going to take place. And Peter will say, if you'll be headed to the end of your New Testament, over to 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter would say that all of that needs to have a very practical impact on me and you. These aren't just grand theological issues for some college professors to sit around in the faculty lounge talking about. These are truths that have impact on how you and I live our lives every single day. That's what Peter contends. And 2 Peter 3, look at verse 10. This is 2 Peter 3:10. But the day of the Lord will come, there's his return, will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. But now look at verse 11. In verse 11 he says, since all these things are to be destroyed in this way, because this is what you believe is coming, what sort of people ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be destroyed by burning and the elements will melt with intense heat. But according to his promise, we are looking for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Then look at 14. Therefore, beloved, since you look for these things, be diligent to be found by him in peace, spotless and blameless. Do you see what he's saying there? Peter says that because this is what we believe, that the end is coming. Jesus will return. Judgment will be taking place. Heaven or hell hang in the balance, because that's what we believe. That ought to impact how people live their lives every single day. It should move us to be holy and godly in our conduct. It should move us to be at peace with Jesus and to live lives that are spotless and blameless. And I could go on and on and on. I'm going to stop there. But surely some of you are sitting there thinking, well, David, if you're going to talk about the end, aren't you going to at least talk about 2 Thessalonians 1 and the fate of the wicked that's described there? And maybe some of you are thinking, well, wait, you haven't done very much with those passages. We could dig in a whole lot deeper. You're right. How long y'all want to stay? I'm not starting home till tomorrow. You could do a whole quarter of Bible classes taking all the New Testament about passages about the end and digging in deep and considering all they have to say. And that's not really my objective tonight. I just wanted to remind you of these passages that many of you are probably already familiar with, and to point out that you can't read the New Testament without knowing the end is coming, which then begs the question, if we know that, how could it ever be that anybody would be making their way through life with no plan for getting out of here? And I think it's probably for the same reason that Carl forgot to talk to that bush pilot. We get caught up in this life and its stuff, and it's so captivating and consuming. I mean, we've got Disney World and college football and iPhones. I left baseball out of that because I just don't want to go there. It was so much to consume us, it's easy to get distracted. So distracted, brothers and sisters, that our minds hardly ever drift to the end that is surely coming. We just don't go there. Not until we have to. And usually when it's too late. And so saying all of that sort of stirs up a second thing in my mind. Something else I see in this story that makes me think about the end that I'm facing. As we ponder that, it occurs to me that we need to be sure that we know what matters. So going back to Carl's story for a minute, I imagine that from Spring's perspective, from the front end of his journey, that Carl may have looked like a pretty smart guy. I have sort of imagined what it would have been like to be in his living room like 2 days before he left. I imagine it being a terrible mess. I don't mean to be judgy, but I do know how the story comes out. I mean, can't you just see his living room littered with all the stuff he needed for this trip? I can see some canvas bags with tent and sleeping bag and that kind of stuff, and boxes with the supplies he was going to take, and some higher quality cases for the camera equipment and the rolls of film. This would have been before the days of digital photography, for those who don't know what a roll of film is. And then those 3 rifles maybe propped up over in a corner across the room. I would have taken more than 3. Looking around the room, you would have thought that he had everything that he needed for a most excellent journey. That's how it looked from the front end. But from Paul's perspective, from the back end of his journey, everything looks completely different, doesn't it? Suddenly, that one omission is so glaring, it just sort of overshadows everything else. What's the point of 500 rolls of film with no plan for getting it all out, right? Now, I want you to know that ultimately Carl did learn what really mattered. He just figured it out too late. And what concerns me, brothers and sisters, is there are an awful lot of people who are making exactly the same mistake on a far grander scale because they're doing it with their life. They're all consumed with the stuff that in the end doesn't really matter. And so from the time children are very young, we begin to impress upon them. You need to make really good grades in school. How many of you check the kindergarten report cards? You can admit it. Go ahead, right? I mean, from the time they first start going to school, we're impressing on them. You need to do really, really well in school. You need to make really, really good grades. Why? What's the point of that? Well, we want them to get a great education, right? So that they can get into a good college if that's the direction they choose to go, and maybe even get a scholarship so mom and dad won't be bankrupted by their college. That would be a good thing. But why? Why do we want them to go to college and get a great education? Well, because once they get out, it would be great if they could get a job. And though we don't say this, get off our payroll, right? To get a job and to have a career. It would be great if they could be a career that they really love, and even better if it could be a lucrative career, right? Those thoughts are there. Why do we want that? What's the point? Well, so they can have stuff. I want my kids to be able to buy a house, drive a car that actually gets to and from work most days in a relatively normal way. Maybe even more than that. Be able to take the kids to Disney. Maybe enjoy some of the nicer things in life. It's okay if the kids are more financially prosperous than we are. And if we can do that, if we can get the great education and the great job and do well in the job and it's lucrative and we can buy a bunch of nice stuff, you know what our culture will do? They will put their stamp of approval on that. And they will say, you have really made it. You've really done something. We even have language for it here in America. We call it living the American dream, and your corporation will acknowledge your accomplishments. They'll give you plaques to hang on the wall to tell you how successful you've been. People will say, you've really made it. You've really done something with your life. I'm just not always sure that is God's assessment of us. And I say that because of Luke 12. Will you go back there? I didn't forget about it. We're coming back to it. Because it seems to me in Luke 12 that this guy is living the American dream, isn't he? He owned his own business. That's what we all want to do, right? And it's a successful business. He has done so well that he's outgrown his facilities, and he's needing to build new facilities to accommodate his growing business. In fact, I can tell you how successful this guy has been. He's able to retire early and go sit on a beach somewhere in a little chair in the sand and watch the sunset. And people would look at him in our culture, and they would put their stamp of approval on that and say, well, that's a guy who's really done something. That's a guy who's made it. And that is not what God said. Are you looking at verse 20? God said that this man was a fool. And I need to be careful here because I always get in trouble when I make this point. Someone goes away and concludes, David said it's bad to have stuff. David is not saying it's bad to have stuff. David has stuff, okay? I need to quit talking about myself in the third person. That's just awkward, isn't it? Jesus does not condemn this man because he had stuff, because he grew a successful business, because he was able to enjoy some leisure time. That's not the problem here. The problem is not with what he had. Do you see that? The problem is with what he did not have. Verse 20 said, so is the man who stores up treasure for himself and what? Is not rich toward God. I hope that if you have a business, you're hugely successful. And I hope that because of it, you're able to buy some nice stuff and retire early. As long as you understand that that stuff is worthless. As long as we don't forget what really matters. And it isn't where we went to school. And it isn't what we drive. In fact, I've often pondered that. There will be some things that nobody's going to say to Jesus on the day of judgment, right? Nobody's going to say to Jesus, do you know what I made on my SAT? Have you seen the profits for my division in the last quarter? I set a record in our company. They had a big banquet for me and gave me a nice plaque to hang on my wall. And while you're looking at my wall, did you see the diploma I have? Did you see the prestigious school that I went to, one in the SEC? I shouldn't have said that here, should I? Have you seen the big house I live in, God? Do you know what part of town it's in? Do you know who lives in my neighborhood? Have you seen the car that I drive? It talks to me. Nobody says that on Judgment Day. Because it isn't the stuff that matters. And here it is. This is the critical thing. Everybody figures that out. Everybody ultimately figures out what really matters. The question is, do we figure it out before it's too late? Which makes me think of one more thing I want to say to you tonight. One more thing that Carl's story prods me to think about, and that is this. We need to be sure that we don't miss our cues, because periodically, brothers and sisters, we get cues about what really matters, and we need to make sure that we don't miss them. Which brings me back to Carl's story. Probably for me the most frustrating thing about Carl's story is that there was a moment in this story where Carl got a cue. And by that I mean there was a moment that he realized he had messed up and still had an opportunity to fix it. Do you see that moment in the story? It's in August. Maybe like right after that airplane disappeared over the horizon and he realized nobody's going to come for me. It's August. Weather's still reasonably good. He's still got food supplies. And Fort Yukon is 75 miles away. What I've never understood about his story is why in August he didn't pack up and start walking to Fort Yukon. That's a long way, 75 miles through the Alaskan wilderness. And they've got bears there. I'm sure it's dangerous. But he's not inexperienced at this. By now, he has spent almost a year in his life alone in the Alaskan wilderness. In all likelihood, this is a journey that he could have made and lived to tell his story. And so one of the things that has bothered me ever since I read his story the first time is once the plane was gone, why didn't he walk to Fort Yukon? Why didn't he think about that until November? And of course, I don't have an answer to that. But I do have some speculation. And it involves 500 rolls of undeveloped film. I'm thinking if you're walking through the wilderness, 75 miles, you're carrying food. You're carrying something to cover yourself up with. You're carrying weapons. You're not carrying undeveloped film. To walk out would have required great sacrifices. And I just wonder if early they were sacrifices he wasn't willing to make. I think we get cues too. I think along the way there are things that happen that remind us the end is coming, and in the end what really matters is being right with God. I need a plan for getting out of here. If at no other time, how about at funerals? Look back to the book of Ecclesiastes for just a minute. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 2. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 7:2, it is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. Have you seen this before? If it was being written for our culture, Solomon would have said, it's better to go to a funeral than to a party. And we read that and we say, that doesn't make any sense at all. Have you noticed that people don't go to funerals anymore? My work requires me regularly to attend funerals. And over the 30 years that I've been doing this thing that I do, I've noticed two things about funeral crowds. They're getting smaller. People don't go. And they're getting grayer. Young people don't go to funerals. Now have a party. In Texas, a party that involves barbecue and a big screen with a football game on it, and you could turn out a lot of young people at a party like that. But let it be a funeral, it's old people who go to funerals. Why is that? In verse 2, he says, it is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, because that is the end of every man. And that is the reason young people don't go to funerals. I know it's a sad occasion, and it can be kind of awkward being around people who are grieving profoundly and all that kind of stuff. And I don't want my kids to see those, all those kind of things we could say. I could tell you why we don't go to funerals. Because that is the end of every man. And when we go, we are compelled to face our mortality. As we look there at that empty human shell and that box, we are forced to recognize that this wasn't some special catastrophe that befell this person. No. This is the way every man and woman journeys. Everyone's journey goes past this place. You know what it means? It means one day it will be my turn. My friends will come together, and someone will get up and give some brief and inadequate summary of my life, and it will be my empty human shell in my box. All of us, brothers and sisters, are destined for a box, and we're on the clock. And when you go to funerals, you have to think about that. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, because that is the end of every man, and the living takes it to heart. There's the problem. I see the people at funerals who don't have a plan for getting out. It is unnerving. They are uncomfortable. Sometimes they even have moments where they're saying, I need to do something. I am not ready. Well, if funerals do that to us, ultimately everybody's got to go, right? I mean, you skip some funerals, but you skip Mama's funeral, the siblings will come looking for you, right? And so if ultimately everybody has to go, why doesn't everybody then address this greatest need? And I think it's in part similar to the reason Carl never started walking. I promise you, brothers and sisters, that the further you get away from God, that road that leads away from Him, the further you go down that road, the harder and harder it is to get back. You need to know that. There may be some addictive behaviors that I develop that are going to be very hard to let go of. And then there's that business of swallowing my pride and having to say, Mom and Dad were right about this all along. And for some people, it's just too much. It's too big a sacrifice, and they're not willing to do it. And so for a few days or a week or so, it bothers them, it torments them. But I promise you, if you'll just hang in there for a little while and resist a little while longer, you will get over it. And you can keep going right along with your life. And you will have missed one of your cues. And for some people, that's not really fair. For most people, they're going to keep missing their cues just like Carl did. Until it's November. And we can't do anything about it anymore. Several years ago, the church family that I'm part of decided that we needed to do a better job trying to recover members of our spiritual family who had drifted away. You know, the Bible talks to us about that. The Bible says, for those who have left the Lord, do not regard them as an enemy, but admonish them as a brother. You know that passage? And so we felt compelled to do a little more admonishing than we had done in the past. And so we were coming into the fall of that year, and what we decided to do is to make a special effort to reach out to some of the people that had been part of our family but had drifted away. We decided that in January of that year, the next year, we would do a special series of sermons with them in mind, lessons that might stir them up and cause them to think about coming back to the Lord. You know, January is often a time, the new year, of spiritual inventory. And we're thinking maybe we can grab hold of that and persuade them to consider their relationship with God. So that was the plan for January. In November and December, we had a team of people who agreed to start reaching out to this folks. We actually assembled a list of 50 people that over the years had drifted away. And this team of disciples agreed that they would start writing letters and making phone calls, and if it was appropriate, go and visiting these wayward disciples and see if we could persuade them to come in January. We printed up some nice invitation cards that we took to them and said, why don't you come in January? That's what we did in November and December. And so January came along, and we did our series, and several of them came, and we were excited about that. But we got all the way through January, and nobody had been restored. Not one of the people who we'd talked to and who had come, none of them had been restored. And so we were disappointed. We felt like we had just failed in all of that effort. We just weren't patient enough. Because by the time February was over, 3 of them had been restored. And then in March, a couple of more. And by the time April was finished, of our list of 50, 7 had come back to the Lord. In fact, the coolest thing is one of our guys had lost all 3 of his daughters. And by the time April was done, all 3 of his daughters had been restored. And we were celebrating. I'm sad to tell you that Howard Green was not among the 7, though he was on our list of 50. I was there the day that Howard was born again. It was a Thursday. I was working in my office, and one of our shepherds came up and tapped on the door, and he said, we're going to have a new birth. You'll want to see this. And so I came out into the auditorium with a couple of other people who happened to be at the building. Howard had been in a Bible study with this shepherd and had decided to obey the gospel. I was there. I watched as Howard was baptized into Jesus Christ. I was one of the very first people to hug his wet head and welcome him into our family. And I can't say that Howard and I became really, really close friends after that, but we were friends. We knew each other. We kind of ran in different crowds in our church family, but when we saw each other, there was a handshake and a side hug for guys, and we got to know each other pretty well. But as that first year of his walk with Jesus went by, some of his old life began to intrude. Y'all know how that happens, right? There are still relationships there that are unhealthy, and there are still temptations that we have to battle, and some of those roots of the former life began to grow plants again that made inroads into Howard's life. And he began to return to some of his old habits. And when our guys became aware of it, they went to him and appealed to him and tried to talk to him about that. But Howard got to be obstinate about it. He was unrepentant and had no intention of ceasing the sin he was involved in. And so our church family was obligated to do what Jesus tells us to do. And we had to pull back from that relationship. We'd had to withdraw from it. And so when we made our list of 50, Howard's name was on the list. And some people that knew him well reached out to him. Our team sent some cards to him. And that went on for several weeks, and then on a Sunday night, our team was gathered to talk about our progress, and one of our guys spoke up and said, I talked to Howard this week. He said, I'm sorry to tell you that Howard said he wanted me to share this with the group, that he doesn't want any more cards. He doesn't want anyone else calling him. He said to tell you, I'm not ever coming back to that church. I want you to leave me alone. I mean, it was just that blunt. So what do you do? I mean, when someone says, I don't want you to try to contact me, what do you do? And so on that Sunday night, our team agreed that we would honor his request. And we would stop calling. It was Sunday night. Thursday of that same week, Howard had been scheduled for a routine medical test. I know it's only routine when it's happening to someone else, but it was pretty lightweight stuff, not serious. But as you know sometimes, routine isn't routine. And they got him on the table, and there were some unexpected complications. And Howard died 4 days later. And I couldn't help but wonder if all that work had been done was the providential hand of God trying to say to him, the end is coming, and it's sooner than you think. And you no longer possess what really matters. And these people who love you, reaching out to you, this is your cue. You need to do something about it. So brothers and sisters, after that experience, I'm saying to you tonight that if your heart is being tweaked by the things that have been discussed because things are not right with you and God, that is the work of God through His Word and His servants giving you your cue, the only one you know for certain you're going to get. So you need to do something about it right now, while we stand, while we sing.